I'm Stefan Wolff. I'm Professor of International Security at the University of Birmingham in England, United Kingdom. I think in my view it's two things. On the one hand, it's sort of an end, let's start again. I think pluralism is two things. On the one hand, it's a means to achieve a particular end, or rather a number of ends, and I would define these ends as peace, justice, and democracy. I realize that they all come with certain values attached to them, but by the same token, I would argue that pluralism in itself, it's an evaluative concept. The more we try to promote pluralism, we also subscribe to certain values that we think pluralism entails, and we do that because I think they achieve, in our view, certain desirable outcomes. On the other hand, I also think that pluralism is really, it's almost like a journey, you could say. It's a never-ending process. So it's not something that you establish at some point and then it's everything sort of peace and happiness afterwards, but it is something that constantly needs to be worked on, but that also changes over time. So what might have been a version of pluralism 100 years ago is something very different today, and it will probably be something rather different in 100 years from now. I think the most important driver for inclusion probably is human agency. It's leadership. It's what people make of pluralist values. So while I do subscribe to some of the drivers that we explore in the project here as being extremely important, whether it's well-being, whether it's education, culture, citizenship, law, politics, history, memory, and so on and so forth, I do think they only become meaning in very concrete circumstances. So you can have perfectly good laws that serve a very positive purpose at one point in time, but these very same laws, constitutions for example, can be interpreted very differently by very different people. So in that sense, I think there is a degree of relationship, if you want, between some of the structural factors that I think are very well expressed in the drivers that I just mentioned, but they won't really come to fruition in the sense that we would see pluralism as a positive way of structuring human interaction without this dimension of human agency. So I think for me, driver almost in a very literal sense has to be a human agent, has to be a leader that buys into the vision of pluralism, but at the same time then has the skill and the determination to actually make it happen. I think in that sense we are going back to the answer that I just gave you, in the sense that I think the major obstacle would be human agency. In many ways, we all have to make choices. Obviously, we make these choices within a range of structures, opportunities that we are presented with, means that we have access to. But as I said earlier, in the same way in which a good law can have good consequences and it can have bad consequences, just the way a judge, for example, interprets the meaning of a particular clause in a constitution or particular paragraph in a law. I think in that sense, again, it comes down to human agency. For me in particular, it comes down to leadership. If you have good leaders, they can actually set the tone of a particular debate. They can show through their own personal commitment that it is worth striving for pluralism, that it is worth taking certain risks for pluralism. And that can set an example then for citizens who buy into that same kind of vision, then actually to be prepared to take certain risks and make things happen that otherwise would not happen. I think they interact very, very closely, and it's quite difficult in my view to ascribe primacy to either one of those. Very often what we see is it's all very context dependent. So economic drivers in many ways can determine sort of the aspirations and the real opportunities that particular cultural groups have. But at the same time, we could argue that particular cultural groups will, because of their culture, make use or not use of particular opportunities, which will then translate or not translate into, for example, a degree of economic prosperity that then in turn will make these values that groups have, sort of turn them into incentives for younger generations to follow in a particular path. So I think from that perspective, we cannot really disconnect the cultural and the economic drivers. But by the same token, I think we shouldn't overemphasize that in the sense of being overly deterministic about cultural preconditions that either make it possible or impossible for different groups, for example, to live together peacefully. So, I mean, I do a lot of work on, in particular, ethnic conflict and conflict management. And one of the things that I found in my own work is that in the end, there are far fewer conflicts around the world than we would have if we followed a hypothesis that different ethnic groups simply cannot live together peacefully. So in that sense, it is again about choices that individuals make. But by the same token, I think there are also quite a lot of structural, very much context-specific factors that make it possible for groups to live together in greater or lesser harmony. And these, of course, very often are connected to levels of economic well-being. And it is not necessarily that the poorest societies have the most conflict or the richest societies are completely free of conflict. It's all, if you want, relative. So what do you compare yourself to? How do you see yourself sit at a local level? Do you think you're being treated fairly there? How do you compare nationally? How do you compare on a more global perspective? So in the way in which people then actually see their own group and themselves as individuals perform, I think that in many, many ways drives how they associate to other groups and to what extent they ascribe a certain responsibility, if you want, to those other groups for their own well-being or otherwise. And then, of course, how do they respond to that? And some groups respond to that in a more constructive way, both the ones that are seen as privileged and the ones that are being seen as underprivileged. And others, of course, well, look at Syria, look at Libya, I mean, even look at some of the more developed countries where we still have quite unreasonably high levels of conflict between groups that is, from a purely rational perspective, only doing harm, and nobody in the end is better off for having conflict. I think well-being is a very important element of, if you want, a structural predisposition towards inclusion. If you feel that as an individual and those in your closest social setting are actually doing well, to some extent I think you are more open to see others included, because you appreciate the value of having this state of well-being. By the same token, there is of course a danger that the more scarce the resources become on which this well-being is based, the more likely is it that you would actually do exactly the opposite and say it is more important for you to defend your own well-being rather than to extend sort of the well-being of all in the sense of a really truly public good to which everybody should have access. So I think in that sense there's always Goethe at some point put it in Faust, there are two souls living in my chest. So one soul, of course, in sort of that rather poetic sense, would want everybody to live well. But the other half of me would say, well, the price for everybody else living well should not be my own, my children's, my family's not living well. So I think in that sense there's a very careful balance that needs to be really managed in order to define what is well-being and how do we organize a society in such a way that everybody can live well. Not in the sense of sort of a completely egalitarian approach, sort of a forcible equalization of all, I grew up in East Germany, so I have a little bit of a personal memory of that. But by the same token, we should also not underestimate that one of the, I think the great injustices is not necessarily poverty as such, but it is in many cases an obscene gap between the rich and the poor. So I do a lot of work in the former Soviet Union, for example, and there what you can see is that people are certainly poorer than they are in Western Europe. They are in some cases even worse off than they were in the Soviet Union. But it is not so much that creates a lot of social tension. It is the fact that the vast majority of society is very, very poorly off. And then there is a very small number of people who are extremely rich and who have become rich on the back of those who are poor. And so you have sort of almost an hourglass society where there is this really big gap between the few at the top and the many at the bottom. And in that sense, again, it's about a degree of, if you want to put it in social science terms, relative deprivation. It's not necessarily that you're poor that is the worst thing. The worst thing is that there is this grave sense of injustice that you are so much worse off than somebody else, and that somebody else may have gotten his or her riches by rather illegitimate means, to put it, well, diplomatically. Is again sort of the point of sort of where we consider ourselves relative to others. So absolutely, I think I've lived for 20 years now in Britain, and there's no question that this is a very stable society with very stable institutions. We just had a referendum on independence in Scotland, and in the end, a majority, although a slim majority, decided that they actually wanted to keep the United Kingdom as it was. But as things evolve over time, at a local level, at a national level, regionally with the European Union, globally in the context of both globalization in general, but also sort of the increasing, not diversity, but sort of the almost the pulling into different directions, the question of the transatlantic relationship and the European relationship. One of the problems that we have had in the United Kingdom is that there is a mismatch between the expectations that people have of their institutions, and in particular also of some of the welfare institutions that were created and that Britain in many ways is famous for, the National Health Service, for example. So the expectations that people have and the ability of these institutions to deliver on those expectations. So in that sense, there's a question here of resources also becoming more scarce, even though we are talking at a much higher level here. So it's not the kind of resource scarcity that you have in some of the poorest countries of sub-Saharan Africa, but it's a resource scarcity that is reflective of a state of development that can no longer keep up with ever-increasing expectations and therefore ever-increasing costs. So some of the problems that we now have in the United Kingdom, for example, in terms of very, very vicious debates over immigration, over minorities, over whether we should be part of the European Union or whether we should pull out. All of that, I think, is on the back that when some of these institutions were created 50, 100, 1,000 years ago, they were created at a very different, almost demographic level for which they could cater then, but for which they apparently cannot cater anymore now. And then we come back to that question that yes, everybody in the UK would probably accept that welfare is a very positive notion, but it should be welfare for us rather than them. And I think the us is increasingly narrowly defined, and the them becomes ever greater. And it may affect now labor migrants from Poland and Romania. Who knows, in 10 or 20 years it might affect people who have lived there for 3 or 4 generations, because they are simply not seen as what by then might be defined sort of a core group of the population that for some historical accident almost is seemingly entitled to the core provisions of the state, to which many, many others have contributed a lot of time, energy, resources. So I think the part of the problem here is, again, sort of this difficulty to see or to be able to accommodate more than yourself. So if we are really apparently very rational, economically thinking human beings, then, well, you always think of yourself and your family first. And the scarcer the resources become to cater for your needs, the more difficult it becomes to actually accept the rights and entitlements of others to that very same scarce resource. The part of the problem then also is that, I mean, these things change. I mean, the founding fathers of the US, at least some of them, one hears, were not exactly opposed to slavery, but that would be something totally unacceptable today. So I think our values to some extent have changed, but our ability to really not just talk the talk, but walk the walk becomes confined and becomes constrained because we hold on in some way to ideals, but we really are not able anymore to pay for them, but we are also not willing to adjust. So how much our own share should reduce for the benefit of others. I think that's a very difficult question. I think it's difficult in particular because we have very highly contested concepts that underpin these notions. So for example, there is the age-old debate over ethnic and civic nationalism. Ethnic nationalism bad, civic nationalism good. But you can look through history and you can find examples where actually ethnic nationalisms in many ways has paved the way towards more democratic institutions. So I think here of Germany at the times of the Napoleonic Wars. It was very much an ethnically, particularly linguistically driven nationalism, but this nationalism paved the way over time for a more democratic, in today's terminology, we might almost say pluralistic Germany to be established. Obviously, there were lapses in German history afterwards that do not testify to particularly deep appreciation of pluralism. But nonetheless, I think it's difficult to say that ethnic nationalism is always a bad thing. By the same token, you could make the argument that civic nationalism is not necessarily always good, because in many ways what it does, it clearly advantages a majority, because civic nationalism in that sense then very often becomes synonymous with a majority, however you conceive it, whether it's in terms of language, whether it's in terms of religion, whether it's in terms of culture. So France, for example, one of the primary models of a civic secular nation, well, I mean, French is the language of the Republic, so you don't speak French, you're not in that sense a proper citizen of the Republic, which of course has created lots and lots of problems over time. So I think, first of all, we have to very much see it in a context dependent way. On the other hand, I also think, and I think this is one of the key messages that I think the whole concept of pluralism has for us, is there needs to be space. There needs to be space for lots and lots of different ways in which people want to express their primary identity or their multiple identities or their hybrid identities or whatever it is. And all of that then, in my view, still needs to fit into an overall concept of a nation, not defined through its adherence with one particular language, religion, and so on and so forth, but rather almost sort of in this very prosaic way the European Union has put it, it's unity in diversity. So we are all different, but in being different, we are all the same, if you want. And the other final point I think that is worth making there is that I think it's to some extent the case in Canada as well, but I know it better in the German context, and that is the whole question that actually what defines you as a citizen is the particular political system in which you are living. So in Germany, this is called constitutional patriotism. So after the Second World War and all the horrendous things that had happened because of Germany and that were committed by Germans, it was very difficult for Germans to develop a positive social identity of themselves based on either their language or their ethnicity or their history or whatever it was. So what they eventually then, and that was a multi-generational process, began to buy in was the idea that they had a really good constitution. Not really a constitution, it's called a basic law, but the idea was that actually you define yourself through the kind of institutions that sort of govern the relationships between different parts of society, between citizens and the state, and so on and so forth. And I think in some of the most successful democracies, you can see similar things. So the Westminster model, for example. I mean, if there's anything, I think, that really defines Britain, it would be the Westminster model. So you have the English, the Welsh, the Scottish, the people in Northern Ireland. But there is an overall sort of buy-in to the idea of the Westminster model. It's not dissimilar, I think, in the United States, for example. So there is also, I think, a degree of justified pride in the Constitution of the United States. And in many ways, you would say sometimes the amendments seem to be even more important than the actual Constitution. But I think in that sense, it's a way in which people of different ethnic, social, cultural, religious backgrounds can identify themselves with an overall vision of a state that again caters for all without distinguishing between whatever your age, gender, ethnicity, sexual orientation, or anything like that is. And I think that is, in my view, sort of a very powerful vision, but it is a vision that I think constantly needs to be resold, if you want. So it's not something that is just there and then for generations you have it. No, it needs to be constantly reiterated, it needs to be reaffirmed, it needs to be deeply embedded in the education system. It needs to be also seen through the actions of political leaders. So political leaders really should then, in that sense, live up to that vision rather than catering to the smallest common denominator or to the lunatic fringes of their own, or what they think are their own constituencies. I don't think so. I think we have had religious difference for, well, time immemorial, almost. We have periods of intense tension, we have had periods of intense fighting between different religious groups, and we have had equally long, perhaps even longer periods in which religions have coexisted. And we have it not only between sort of the major world religions, but we also have it within them. I mean, look at the Sunni Shiite schism that you see emerge very, very rapidly and very, very viciously now across the entire Middle East and probably beyond. But at the same time, I mean, in Germany we had a period in the 19th century called the cultural struggle. Kulturkampf was very much fought between the Protestant North and the Catholic South. Not fought to the same extent that it is fought today between Sunnis and Shias in some parts of the world. But nonetheless, it actually had its own term. It's a particular period in German history around the unification of Germany in the second part of the 19th century. So I think from that perspective, first of all, there is nothing, I think, that is in that sense special about religion if you look at it over a long period of time. So religions can absolutely live together in harmony if they sort of mutually respect the fact that people believe in different ways of doing things and who to worship. By the same token, obviously, I mean, all religions have a degree of exclusivity to themselves. So they have a supreme truth, and there can only be one of those. But that in many ways is not different from other forms of identification. So you cannot be of two ethnicities. You can maybe be of mixed ethnicity if you have parents from different ethnic backgrounds. But I'm German by ethnicity, and no matter for how long I will have carried my British passport, I will always be ethnically German and not English, or if I move to Scotland, Scottish or something like that. So there is a degree of a similar exclusivity that you can't be of two religions, you can't be of two ethnicities. And with ethnicities, I think the exclusiveness is even stronger. You can convert from one religion to another, but I cannot convert from a German ethnicity to a British or any other kind of ethnicity. But then I think it also comes back to the question of choice. I mean, why do we have places where different ethnic, different religious groups live together in relative peace and harmony? And why do we have places where that does not seem to be possible? And I think this, again, is very much related to the choices that people make. Do they actively choose and work for peaceful coexistence, if you want, or do they actually promote personal agendas on the back of particular differences, and then these differences become exacerbated, and then these differences lead to violence? So there's nothing from that perspective that I would say is either special about religion or should make us fear religion or avoid religion. It's what we make of it, what we make of the things that are written in the various holy books. I don't think it does. It only does to the extent that religious mobilization aims to achieve a particular structure of society that then would favor one religion over another. So in that sense, I mean, we are coming back to the idea of pluralism being sort of there for all, as long as all respect each other and respect difference. Where that becomes exclusionary, then absolutely it challenges the secular state, but it does not only challenge the secular state, it would challenge any particular state. So, for example, I mean, if you look at the Arab Spring and sort of the different trajectories that countries that started down a very similar path have taken, I think there's a very informative comparison to be made here between Egypt and Tunisia. You had two reasonably similar societies. You had the revolutions of the Arab Spring, you had elections. Elections brought to power Islamic political movements. But then from there, it went into two totally different directions. So in Egypt, if you want, you had a very specific and deliberate entrenchment of the Muslim Brotherhood that basically was not able and or not willing to see that not everybody in Egyptian society embraced their vision of how the state should be structured. So their choice was to take an electoral victory and turn that not into something that could sort of recur after 4 or 5 years and give somebody else a chance, but really sort of to have one opportunity in a lifetime, and for many people that was the first election in which they could vote, and then cement a status that was created then into a permanent way of organizing society. In Tunisia, you have a very different trajectory. There also, Ennahda, a Muslim political party, won the elections. initially went down a very similar path of structuring or restructuring Tunisian society on the basis of Islamic beliefs, values, cultures. But when challenged by people who were more secular-minded, who were very broadly speaking, perhaps more tolerant of other views, when challenged, they actually negotiated. They made it possible for a democratic, if you want, pluralistic process to continue that would not entrench for another generation or more a particular political structure. So in that sense, Tunisia, if any of the countries of the Arab Spring, still has a realistic chance to actually live up to the aspirations of the people who started the Arab Spring, whereas in Egypt, we are almost back to square one now, where we started with Mubarak. And it's difficult to judge whether one or the other is, so whether Morsi or Mubarak or now al-Sisi in any way are better. I think it's the problem that we have in countries like that. It's sort of a mentality of winner takes all. It's all or nothing. So there is, in that sense, no, if you want, historical culture, no long-term trajectory of compromise, of sort of an appreciation and mutual respect of different points of view. But that, in a way, is in many ways is not confined at all to the Arab world. I mean, what we could observe in Ukraine almost from early 1991 was a very similar process. You have elections, president gets elected, basically cleans the slate, establishes all of his, in this case, all of his people across the different regions, across the sort of money-making enterprises, and so on and so forth. Next president comes in, same thing again. So there's, in that sense, there's a similar kind of winner-takes-all mentality that is very much counter the ideas of pluralism, that generally drives crises regardless of, if you want, the broader cultural or social fabric of society. So I think from that perspective, pluralism in that sense is a very useful tool by which we can judge sort of the resilience of societies to change in personnel without necessarily eroding sort of a more profound framework that enables well, the peaceful coexistence of all the different segments of society.